I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Welcome to Los Angeles, California. Welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, TV's Connor Ruebusch, and with me is Dr. Patrick Wyman, host of the vastly more popular Tides of History podcast. It's a great day for America, Pat. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Doing great. Happy to be here in Los Angeles with TV's own Connor Ruebusch.
Why? Appreciate that. Why is Tides of History so much more successful in this one? Because it can't be the esoteric nature of the subject matter, because that's what we do here. It can't be the music and sound effects, because we have amazing music and sound effects on this show. So what's the difference between the show you do alone and this one? Like, honestly, I can't put my finger on it.
I don't know. I really can't tell. I think it could be there's more Lucy on this show. I think that's a part of it.
Yeah.
I think that's really, she's she really serves to drive away a large portion of the audience.
She just gives off a certain vibe that even comes through, orally.
She wants people off her lawn, and her lawn apparently includes our show.
All right. Well, thanks, Lucy, for that. I really appreciate it. And so does my bank account. And today we've got a fantastic show for you. We are going to be talking about UFC 216. And the top 7 fights on this card, I would say, are pretty damn good. And basically all the fights on the card are interesting in one way or another. I think it's a pretty solid card, even if it does not have that marquee appeal that you might want from, an event like this. But on today's main episode, this week's main episode, we are going to be talking about 4 of the fights from this card. We're going to cover the main event, interim lightweight title fight between Tony Ferguson and Kevin Lee, the co-main event between Demetrius Johnson and Ray Borg, a rescheduling of that bout after Borg failed to make weight just a few weeks ago. And then we're also going to talk about Tom Duquesnoy versus Cody Stamen and Beneil Dariush versus Evan Dunham, whom, if you might recall, I named recently as one of my picks for best unranked fighters in the UFC. So let's start off with the main event, now that we've gotten our introductions out of the way. Tony Ferguson, Kevin Lee, overall thoughts on the fight, my friend?
This is a really good fight.
Yeah.
I have to say, after watching all the tape, after following both guys' careers for pretty much the entirety of the time they've been in the UFC, actually, in both cases, the entirety of the time they've been in the UFC, I'm surprised that Ferguson isn't a bigger favorite over Lee. Ferguson is currently minus 220 at 5 dimes. He's kind of ranging between minus 215 and minus 235. That seems low here because I see a couple of paths to victory for Lee, but they're pretty slim. Like, I would peg Ferguson as at least a 3-1, maybe 3.5 to 1 favorite. Like, I'm surprised that he's only 2-1 here. That's a matter of expressing mathematically, like, kind of my thoughts on the matchup as a whole. Like I get a couple of ways in which Lee could win the fight, but they seem really slim to me, like really, really slim for a matchup of this caliber.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both recognize that Kevin Lee is a very solid fighter. I think both you and I probably still look at him as a fighter with more potential than he has current greatness necessarily, even though he is progressing faster than I expected, has gotten bigger wins than I expected. I mean, I picked Michael Chiesa to beat him, and that didn't happen. And, barring the weird ending to that fight, Michael Chiesa was literally half a second from going totally unconscious. So Kevin Lee won, and he looked pretty good doing it. So Kevin Lee's legit. And, I guess I should say, since Michael Chiesa is, of course, the legendary RNC King, the RNC King is dead. Long live the RNC King. Because Kevin Lee came into that fight with the second highest number of rear naked chokes in the division after Chiesa, and now he's tied with a rear naked choke over Chiesa. So he's the guy now. If you're worried about somebody taking your back, Kevin Lee is obviously very potent in that kind of position.
Yeah, well, so, okay, I agree with all of that. Let's take a step back here and try to figure out what it is about who is Kevin Lee as a fighter, what does he do well, what do we think of him, how do we evaluate him, and how does that play into a matchup with Ferguson? Because I think we understand Ferguson's game pretty well. I think our audience has seen Ferguson in a number of high-profile matchups. I think y'all know who and what he is at this point, fairly safe to say. Not that we don't have anything to add, and we'll talk about him, but like Lee is the less-known quantity here. So I think everything with Lee has to start with his physicality. He's exceptionally quick. He is freakishly strong. Like some of the takedowns that he can complete from the positions that he's in are insane. He is a freakish physical specimen, really well put together, looks right. And I think that when he does things, they generally look right.
Yes.
I don't necessarily think, especially on the feet, that he actually knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I'll make a comparison to another fighter we've said similar things about, Gilbert Burns. Kevin Lee, to me...
Oh, there's a great comparison. Oh, my God, that's a great comparison.
Right, because the striking looks pretty good, but you can see when the exchanges happen. This might be a strange way to phrase this, but I think Kevin Lee's ground game, which is obviously his strength, his wrestling and his grappling, those are based on feel, how it feels to him. He knows what the right moves are because he can feel when to make them. And on the feet, everything is still looks. Am I throwing this punch... Does it look the right way when I'm throwing it? Does it look the right way when I make this step? But the feel is still not there. And that's why...
And by feel, you're not just talking about natural talent. Like, that's highly trained and developed feel. Like, he is a well-trained fighter.
Yeah, like the kind of feel you have to get through a lot of experience. You can also, tailor your training to work on that kind of thing, to have that kind of sense of flow. And we'll talk about the mysterious term known as flow state when we get to Tony Ferguson. But Kevin Lee doesn't have that on the feet. Everything is like, for example, let's talk about the Michael Chiesa fight. I think that fight really gives you a good idea of everything that Kevin Lee has to offer, because he got basically nothing done on the feet. Looked agile, looked quick. But every single time that Michael Chiesa would lunge in with a left hand, Kevin Lee was surprised. He never saw it coming, and he never had a response so ingrained into him that he could pull it off without thinking to avoid that left hand or respond to it. As soon as
he's an extremely rote fighter.
Yes,
on the feet.
Feet.
And much more so that I think his takedown chains, there's real brilliance there. I think his ground game, he is exceptionally organic. I think he does a great job of adjusting to what his opponent's showing him. He's got some truly devastating ground strikes, great posture, great fundamentals on the mat. Like, he is a well-trained grappler. Robert Follis is a really, really good grappling coach and a good head MMA coach, and has done a very good job of taking what Lee already does well on the mat and made it that way. But on the feet, Lee is... Lee is well game planned for. His coaches do a good job of giving him the right tools to do what he needs to do. So when he's fighting southpaws, he throws a great lead right hand, an increasingly good lead right hand that has no telegraphing, no setup for it. He just throws it, which is what you need to do with a lead.
And an increasingly good right high kick.
Yeah, so this was really noticeable when he fought Francisco Trinaldo. Was what do you do when you want to make sure a southpaw with a hard left hand doesn't throw it? You throw right high kicks to pin their left hand in place next to their temple so they don't get head kicked. Lee threw that over and over and over again. That was part of the game plan. He threw lead rights over and over again. That was the game plan. But you're right in terms of feel. He just doesn't really have it. Like, he doesn't adjust well to what his opponent's showing him. He doesn't seem to feel the space of the cage especially well, either offensively or defensively. When he tries to go from strikes to takedowns, like, there's like a step missing.
And that's why I brought up Chiesa Lee, because the way the turning point in that fight was not any part of Kevin Lee's design. The turning point in that fight was Kevin Lee not knowing exactly the best way to respond to a sudden rush of aggression from Chiesa, rolling his ankle and falling down to his back. But the moment Chiesa was on top of him, Lee was flowing. He had feel. He had the butterfly hook. He was immediately fishing for an underhook. It was all about creating, controlling space, and working himself back into a position. The contrast between the guy who fell down because he's not 100% sure how he's supposed to move his feet, and the guy who instantly got on top of Michael Chiesa after having him on top of him is pretty strong.
Yeah, I mean, so I think as far as the matchup with Ferguson goes, this is fairly straightforward to me. That if this stays on the feet for any extended period of time, Ferguson, after getting hit with more lead rights and right kicks early than he needs to, is going to adjust. And when he does, he's going to absolutely carve up Lee. But Ferguson has been a guy who has gotten through most of his career in this division without really worrying too much about being taken down, without really worrying too much about scrambling. And Lee, I think, could give him real problems if they get into those kinds of grappling exchanges, like way more so than Ferguson is used to being in. I think Ferguson could very easily find himself in trouble because he's wild, because he likes to take risks, because he likes to roll with momentum. And when you roll with momentum, you create opportunities and openings. Like there's like Ferguson's kind of funk style approach to defending takedowns is going to create scrambles. And when you create scrambles with a guy like Lee, who's as physically gifted, as strong, and has such great feel, like you pointed out, Connor, there's a lot of opportunities in there that for Lee to get some work done. Now, with that said, I still think that Ferguson is going to it's much more likely that this fight stays in Ferguson's areas of expertise than it does go to Lee's. Yeah,
I think I was a little wary at the top of the discussion when you said what you said about the odds, but I would be surprised if Kevin Lee won this fight. I mean, it would be a very unexpected result. I don't think there's any reason that Tony Ferguson shouldn't be a pretty considerable favorite. And again, not a knock on Kevin Lee, just Tony Ferguson's there. You know, he's pretty much a complete fighter. He's in the stage where he's just sort of adjusting how he accomplishes his various goals in each fight, but his game works against a wide array of styles. He has a lot of options at his disposal and never seems like he's, lost for ideas.
There was a stage in Ferguson's career where you could say that guy has too many ideas about what he's doing. And you still made it work, but like there were times where you were like, what the fuck is this guy doing out there?
Yeah. And sometimes you still have that feeling, but Ferguson has found a way to make that work now in a way that it didn't before. We'll talk.
What do you think is the key turning point there?
Well, flow state. That was something that was going around a lot before the McGregor fight. Part of the sort of discussion, the idea that was put out there a lot on Twitter was flow state. This idea that McGregor is in this phase where he can just sort of, this movement training thing. It's like that. It's very, very sort of esoteric and indefinable, but really, I mean, it's useless as a teaching tool when you tell somebody this is flow state. It also sounds like some Silicon Valley jargon bullshit, so nobody wants to hear those two words put together. But Tony Ferguson has flow. Tony Ferguson is not what I usually expect from a fighter who has flow, like a Floyd Mayweather, who I've talked about many times now since Maymac, his systematic approach to defense and how everything links to everything else perfectly. There's always 2 or 3 predetermined options. Tony Ferguson, and I'm interested to hear your take on how this is possible, has the same style of leaping from option to option seemingly without hesitation or even thought, but I don't think it's systematic. I don't think it's nearly as systematic and well-defined as Mayweather's. He is really just like the ultimate feel fighter. And it doesn't, like we talked too about the difference between MMA
why can't feel be systematic?
It certainly can. It's just that I don't think that, like, Ferguson does things that are very clearly not exactly tied into what he's been working on the pads or something, like the salsa dancing moves against Rafael dos Anjos, where he is putting himself into positions that I'm sure he doesn't have like a 1,000 times trained response for that exact positioning of his feet as he's spinning around and bending over, curling up his back on his feet and all that. But he seems, I think he has what Lee has on the ground. He seems to understand balance and weight distribution and distance so well that he always knows exactly what's the best direction to go next, what's the weapon that's loaded up after I've done this move. He feels those things really naturally, it seems to me.
Well, so I think that what's systematic about Ferguson's approach are 2 things, pace and distance. I think that Ferguson understands on an exceptional level how distance works and what he can do at every individual distance and what options are available to him, where his opponent is relative to him, what his opponent's weapons at that range are, and how he can use the shifting between those spaces to his advantage, right? So Ferguson Ferguson, far more so than practically every other fighter in this division, can fight you at every range. He can fight you at kicking distance. He can fight you in the pocket. He can fight you at infighting range. He can fight you in the clinch. He can fight you in all of those spaces really, really well. He can beat you at any one of those ranges. But what makes Ferguson really dangerous on the feet is the way that he goes back and forth between those, the way that he is constantly adjusting from range to range. And so even if you could stick Ferguson at one range, you're still going to be in trouble. Yeah. But if you can't stop Ferguson from moving ranges, then you're just screwed.
Which makes for a really interesting contrast here, because Lee, at least on the ground, the contrast is really fascinating, and I do hope to see these guys grapple, because as you said, Ferguson is like go with the flow, it's all funk, take the force and do something with it, and Lee is much more of a sort of lockdown float, but keep the heavy pressure and force the reaction you want. So it's the lockdown guy versus the anti-lockdown guy. I think that's pretty fascinating, actually.
Yeah, I mean, even they both are pretty good at things like getting to the back and in transition. They're both really good transitional grapplers, but in drastically different ways. Yeah. So Ferguson is a quick strike guy. Like if you leave him an opening, he will grab it and kill you with it. Even though he's good at finding those openings and exploiting them, Lee is much more of I grab the position, now I solidify the position, now I finish you with it. Like, it took him a couple of tries it wasn't hard for him to get to Francisco Trinaldo's back, but it took him a couple of tries to get the finish. He was on Chiesa's back, softening him up for a long time before the finish happened. Whereas when Ferguson grabs somebody's back, that fight is over in a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
or grabs a Darce or what have you.
There's got to be something right in how Tony Ferguson prepares. He is well known as one of the few fighters in MMA who really runs his own camp. I think he's up in Big Bear, up by.
So he'll go up at altitude, but he works with a lot of different people. He spent a lot of time. He spent a lot of time boxing. He grapples with Eddie Bravo. He's kind of all over the place.
But he's doesn't look like, like a lot of times they say that somebody will suffer from running their own shit because they don't have any impetus to work. Obviously, Tony Ferguson is an insanely dedicated, hard-working fighter in training, but I have to assume that. Okay, I'm going to read too much into something I saw here, but. I watched Tony Ferguson, a very brief clip, I think it was from a recent Embedded or something, of him hitting the speed bag, which, probably 90% of MMA fighters don't really do it very much at all. It's a thing that boxers do. But B, he might be the only MMA fighter I've ever seen hitting a speed bag in what I would call the correct or best way, where he was moving his feet, he was changing distance, changing hands almost at random. He also worked in elbows, which is something that boxers do sometimes to show off, even though it's not legal in boxing. And he was, playing with the rhythm of the bag. And I don't know if that says a lot about how Tony Ferguson trains or where his style comes from, but those kinds of tools I think are underappreciated in MMA because they're not appreciated as much as they should be because they give you feel. Things like a speed bag, double end bag, things like partner drills, things like sparring, like flow rolling. These things give you a feel for the kind of stuff you were talking about, specifically distance, but also timing. And the crazy thing about Tony Ferguson is how well he can pick what seems like a totally low percentage, uncalled for strike or submission out of thin air, but it's exactly the right one for the opportunity. He's not just a quick strike finisher. He picks the right strike a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, you can see this with, I think the core of his game is his boxing, right? Yeah. Like what Ferguson does, what allows Ferguson to do all the rest of the stuff is that he has exceptionally quick and powerful and snappy hands. Yeah. He really has a lot of power. He's a prime example of what we talk about when we talk about snappy power, where it doesn't look like he's throwing that hard, but every punch lands at exactly the right spot in the arc. Right?
He's got he's like a mini semi-Schilt in the way his punches land. He's got sort of a telephone pole effect because the extension is just right at that 90% extension mark.
Exactly.
He fucks people up when he hits them, man. He has more power than you would think.
Yeah, the fact that he hit Rafael dos Anjos as many times as he did and dos Anjos didn't go down is testament to how fucking tough Rafael dos Anjos is. Just like a rawhide dude.
Yeah.
But like, so Ferguson, that's the core of Ferguson's game, and everything else that Ferguson does builds off that in some meaningful way. And that's kind of his safety blanket. So he can do all this wild shit with elbows and knees and kicks and spinning shit because he knows that when he really wants to, he can step back to boxing distance and just jab your face off, which he did to Dos Anjos a whole bunch in that fight. Like when he would try all of this really complicated stuff, and then he would settle back in and be like, okay, now we're just going to box in the pocket for a little while. I'll move my head when you throw at me and I'm going to counter you. Like all of this really basic, fundamentally sound, strong boxing complemented by all this wild and crazy stuff. And I think that that's something that we have to remember here, is that as unorthodox as Tony Ferguson is, the stuff that he does is really genuinely pretty fundamentally sound. Like he throws strikes the right way. He moves his head the way that he's supposed to. His balance is great. He's pretty much always centered. Like he's not throwing himself into weird shit. Like there is a plan there. Like it's a quick developing and kind of fluid plan.
Yeah.
But his plan is always, I'm going to mess with my opponent's perception of distance. I'm going to push an incredible pace, and I'm just going to hit him a lot with a whole bunch of different things.
Tony Ferguson fights like he's driving like through the central U.S. at night with no reflectors, no street lights, just his headlights on. He can see the road only 30 feet ahead of his car, but you'd be surprised how quickly he can react to turns and obstacles that pop up out of the darkness.
But because he knows where he's going, right?
Yeah.
Like to continue with that metaphor, he knows what the end goal is. The end goal is that he has better cardio, he's tougher, and he probably hits harder. So that's the kind of fight that he wants to force. And that he's more unorthodox than his opponent. He's got more tools in his toolbox.
Yeah, and so we were talking about confidence last week. We should just tie all those together and say Tony Ferguson is an insanely confident fighter because he knows where the fucking road's going. He knows the road's going to be there. He has no fear that if he tries something, he's not going to find a way to make it work.
Yeah, honest to God, I think the only fighter in this division that I wouldn't immediately pick, the only two fighters in this division I wouldn't immediately pick Ferguson over are Khabib and McGregor, and I probably would
pick him over both.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing. Is like those are the only two where it's not automatic.
Yeah,
like I would pick him. I would definitely pick him over Khabib. I would take that. With the way McGregor's improved his boxing, I think he could make that really interesting.
Yeah.
But I would still probably pick Ferguson there. I think he's the best lightweight on the planet.
Yeah, you still got Ferg's grappling. Like, what if McGregor just happens to react slightly? That's the thing. Like, Ferguson gives you so much shit to worry about. He always knows he's going to just explore whatever options are open after he does it. But you're reacting. You don't have the initiative, so it is so much harder to keep up with him than it is for him to keep up with his own options. It's just so like if even a guy like Conor McGregor, who can probably match him. He can definitely match him in a lot of ways technically and for power and reach on the feet. If he reacts wrong once to a rolling knee bar, to like an Imanari roll, he's suddenly in Ferguson's, world. I mean, Ferguson is just like, he's like an ideal MMA fighter in a weird way. Like he's not unhittable. He's not everything lands perfectly. He's not like this smooth, clean artist in the way that we usually think of when we say a perfect fighter, but he just has an answer to everything. It's pretty remarkable to watch him fight. And hopefully when we see him battle Kevin Lee this weekend, even though the both of us are expecting him to get the win there without too much trouble, we will have some more interesting things to say, some revelations gleaned from that fight to share with you on next week's show. Before we wrap up this segment, though, let's we're both picking Ferg. Let's give an actual specific pick. What do you like him in?
I think Ferguson by third round submission. I think the first round is going to be a lot closer than people think it's going to be. I think the second round, Ferguson will start to take Lee apart. In the third round, I think Lee is going to try to bull his way into the clinch, leave his head down, and get snapped down and darsed as he kind of gets tired and beaten up. Maybe after a knockdown, also. I just think that it is hard for me to see the scenario in which Lee wins this fight, because even if they start scrambling, even if they get into the kind of fight that you would think might favor Lee. I think Ferguson is still big and strong and physical enough that he's not going to get tossed around. I think he's a good enough scrambler that those scrambles are just as dangerous for Lee as they are for Ferguson. I really think this fight drastically favors Ferguson. Weird for me to think that it favors him more than the betting line suggests when he's already a 2-1 favorite. But I would be shocked if he didn't win this.
Yeah, I'm not quite, just because I think that Kevin Lee's style poses an interesting threat. Like if Kevin Lee gets to work his game on the ground, again, that's a much narrower path to victory already. But if he gets to, he may have exactly the style of grappling you need to beat Tony Ferguson, to stick him in single positions and make him suffer for it. But the path is that doorway is a little too narrow for me to think that he has a great shot as well. So I'm with you. I would say a third round TKO would have been my pick, but I think see more or less the same fight as you. And with that, why don't we move on? We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to move on to the co-main event, which we have already discussed in the past, so we'll probably do that fairly briefly. But Demetrius Johnson, Ray Borg, and after that, Tom Duquesnoy, Cody Stamen, and Beneil Dariush versus Evan Dunham on Heavy Hands. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. Demetrius Johnson, Ray Borg, the rescheduled UFC flyweight title. Dana White did his best to bury it under another fight that he hated, under Nunes Shevchenko 2, the also rescheduled title fight. Now he's buried it under an interim title fight on this card, another one that probably won't draw that well, which is a shame because just as it was when we last discussed it, it's still a pretty good fight. And even though Ray Borg, like most of Demetrius Johnson's challengers, is not ready for DJ yet, at least that's what we think, he's stylistically one of the potentially stiffer tests in the division. I think that's sort of the conclusion we came to when we talked about this before.
Yeah, that there are specific ways in which Borg is capable of troubling Johnson because of his speed, his physicality, and the way in which Borg is really good at catching you in transitions, and Johnson's game is all about those transitions, right? The way we approached this last time was we tried to talk about what a successful game plan to beat DJ would look like. Like, what would that fight entail? And it would involve somebody who can match or exceed DJ's speed, which Borg can do. Beating him in scrambles and transitions on the ground, and hitting him as he's doing things on the feet, because Johnson's game is so heavily predicated on thinking about what the next 2, 3, or 4 things are going to be after he does the thing that he's currently doing, that you can hit him while he's doing something. You can hit him while he's moving. You can hit him while he's throwing, because his mind is already on whatever the next thing is. Those are all things that Borg can do. Borg is as fast or faster than Demetrius Johnson. He is a dangerous scrambler. He's great at getting to the back in transition. He's great at not winding up on the bottom and kind of when you're enmeshed in takedown chains. And he's really good on the feet. He's a limited striker, but the one thing that he's really, really, really good at is same time counters. So the ingredients are there for Borg to have success against Johnson. It's just a matter of trying to actually pull that off.
Yeah, we also talked about potentially, secret weapon being, of course, Jackson Wink and Brandon Gibson, who have obviously had a tremendous impact on Ray Borg's success and skills already. We talked also about his youth, how quickly he is improving. There are a lot of things to like about Ray Borg as a challenger. And I think also that Borg, like Cejudo, I think I was maybe a little more pessimistic about this last time, but I think Ray Borg probably won't be obliterated by this loss. Like, I think it might be early enough that he can look back in 2 years and justify it as a prospect loss. So he can, I don't think they're going to ruin him with this shot, barring some terrible unforeseen circumstance. So
no,
I'm okay with this fight. I kind of like it. Our conclusion last time was that essentially the experience is not there for Ray Borg. Does the fact also that he missed weight or basically chose not to weigh in, I guess. Is that what happened? He chose not to do it because he wasn't going to make it?
Well, he got sick.
Okay.
He was apparently sick all fight week and could not, and was apparently, he said that he was in good shape to make the cut, that he was down to like 133 a few days beforehand. So making that last, basically his water cut was not going to be a big issue, but that he was ill and, so on and so forth.
But this is, I think, the third time Borg has had some weight issues. Does that change?
And has gotten sick the week of the fight. Like, this
right.
is
the two are maybe not disconnected. The sickness is maybe not a coincidence while you're cutting weight.
Anything that happens to you physically the week of the fight, like while you're cutting weight, is weight cut related.
Yeah.
Because you're suppressing your immune system. You're not eating the way you should. You're still engaging in a pretty high level of physical activity. Mm-hmm. Like he says it wasn't weight cut related. Well, if you get sick because your immune system is shot to shit because you've been having to cut weight like a crazy person for weeks to get down to the point where you could make it.
Right.
Like, it's always weight cut
It wasn't weight cut related. I just had flu-like symptoms. It's like, yeah, well.
Yeah. Why did you get those flu-like symptoms?
Probably
Let's think about the causality here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's like saying I didn't have any training injuries. I got staph infection. Like, it's not exactly, but there's a connection I think you're missing.
That's actually a perfect metaphor for this.
Yeah. So does that change your impressions of? I mean, we already picked Demetrius, as I think every other MMA fan in the world probably will, except for those who are really, really eager to say "I told you so" when the impossible does happen. Does the weight issue, however, change your idea of how competitive Borg might be or how long the fight might last? I mean,
it doesn't, but that's just because. I don't think anybody could look at this fight and think that Borg was going to be the guy winning the 4th and the 5th rounds.
Sure.
Yeah. I think the question is, I think Borg can win the 1st round, even without, I think Borg's best way to win this fight is to knock down an RNC DJ. I think that's probably the play here. But if it's going to have to be a winning rounds thing, I think his speed and his timing and kind of awkward rhythm and having a really good game plan can win him the 1st round. I think the 2nd, it's dicey. I think by the 3rd, there's no way that he's going to be able to keep up the pace that Johnson is going to want to push despite training at altitude. And there's no way he's going to be able to put up with the variety of things Johnson is going to show him.
Yeah, especially if, as we guessed, a lot of Borg's game plan will hinge on the idea of pressuring Demetrius Johnson. It's going to force an even higher pace than he might normally prefer. But that is probably a necessary gambit if you're hoping to actually beat the champ. Like, you probably want to make him back up and react to you as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the better way of looking at this. But, yeah, I mean, I think you want DJ reacting to you as much as possible. And I think that's – if he can seize the initiative early, then that will give him the best chance of landing that fight-changing shot or initiating that scramble that's going to put him in a position to end the fight. I don't think you can go out there as Borg's coaches. I think you have to game plan to maximize your chances to finish the fight rather than maximizing your chances of winning rounds. They're not the same thing. And I don't think you can plan on winning rounds.
Yeah, and does that take how do you frame that to your fighter too? Like, doesn't that take a chunk out of your confidence if your coach is like, you can't win a decision, we need to finish him. We talked about that on last week's episode. Like, anytime you tell your fighter you have to do this, that kind of pressure can be detrimental, or like, watch out for this, worry about this, whatever. So I do wonder, it is still difficult for me to say how Ray Borg is going to look. Because, again, I just don't think he's ready for this yet. There's just not enough time. But in other flyweight news, before we move on, they did remake Cejudo versus Sergio Pettis, which looks even more interesting than it did then in light of their 2 recent wins. Both Sergio and Henry looked phenomenal in their last fights. And it's not like you've got a meaningful win, you're fighting DJ situation. They're letting contenders sort out the division, which I like. They're putting a hierarchy together, which is how these rankings work. So, things are moving forward. The flyweight division...
Things is happening. Things is happening.
The flyweight division does still have good and more interesting things in the future, and it's not that Ray Borg is a joke or that he doesn't even necessarily deserve a title shot in a division with not a lot of clearly deserving contenders. It's just that the circumstances aren't really kind to people in Borg's position at this stage in UFC flyweights existence. So let's move on. Both of us picked Demetrius Johnson. This is the part where I embarrassed myself by making a different pick than I did last week, but I think I probably said 3rd or 4th round submission, and I think that still feels about right to me.
Yeah, I think 3rd, 4th, 5th into the 5th round. I think that Johnson eventually gets him, and this will set Demetrius Johnson's record as the winningest champion in UFC history, the most title defenses.
Yeah. Well, why don't we let that just be a short segment then? And when we come back, we've got 2 other fights to talk about. Tom Duquesnoy makes his UFC return after I was going to say a thrilling debut, but I could have just said after another Tom Duquesnoy fight. This one happened to be in the octagon, but if you don't know who Tom Duquesnoy is, please stick around. We are going to get you very excited for a very, very violent young man. He is fighting Cody Stamen, who I have a lot of really, really bad pun-based nicknames based on his last name. We'll get to that later. And then we're also going to talk about Beneil Dariush versus Evan Dunham after this break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Tom Duquesnoy, the Fire Kid, returns his sophomore effort in the UFC, fighting Cody Stamen. Cody Stamen, in my book, will forever now be the Blossom Hog. But also...
the Blossom Hog? What does that mean?
Well, a stamen is the penis of a flower.
Oh, okay.
So it's sort of a... Okay. All of my nicknames are sort of horticultural and not particularly funny. But... Okay. But I spent a good portion on recent vivisection coming up with those. We had Cody the Pedal Dick, Cody the Flower Cock, Cody the... There's a few options. So take your choice. But Cody Stamen is a good fighter and looked really good, pretty damn good in his UFC debut, in a very fun fight, by the way. If you haven't seen Stamen versus Ware, you should still check it out. It was a lot of fun to watch. I think a fascinating fight. A perfect time for both guys to get a prospect versus prospect bout to determine who's going to move forward right now and who needs another little while to get themselves going in the UFC.
Yeah, these are both guys, both Duquesnoy and Stamen are experienced prospects. They're not guys who just started fighting yesterday. Duquesnoy's got 5 years under his belt. Stamen's got 6. These dudes are coming into their primes and they're ready to be pushed. They're ready to, if whoever wins this fight, I think, is going to be ready to take not like a top 15 fight, but like a fringe top 15-y kind of fight. There's no real reason to wait with either of them. Like, they're both they're both pretty developed skill wise. They don't have glaring holes in their game. They're still going to be adding things, but a lot of what they're going to be adding is polish and refinement, more so than like whole new skill sets at this point. Like, both of these guys should know how to defend takedowns, shoot takedowns, scramble, work on top, work from their backs, work at distance, work in the clinch. If they don't know how to do those basic things already, they're not going to learn. Yeah, and they do. Both of them know how to do all of those things. They're like fully rounded fighters. I did not see Stamen's UFC debut, even though it was at UFC 213, which I was at live because we were stuck in an Uber and did not get there for that. So this was the first time I had watched the fight.
Good bout.
Versus Ware. Yeah, it was a really good fight. I was really impressed by him. He throws a great left hook. He's got pop, works at a good pace. Doesn't load up on anything. Really throws with good, sound, fundamental technique. Nice kicking game.
And beyond that, the thing that stands out, yeah, you were probably just about to say it. The thing that stands out in my memory is that he fights like a fighter who is much more experienced than he is. The way that he timed.
Experienced though. He's got 16 pro fights and had a bunch of amateur fights before that.
He's not a novice. He's young, but he does. Okay, so even then, should say that what stood out was the experience that comes through in his fighting. There were times in that fight, despite the fact that Stamen was like the harder hitter and the better athlete and clearly had his timing and was landing his strikes, he could have agreed to a relatively 50-50 striking battle, but he never did that. He never did it, even trying to put on a show in his debut. He timed takedowns strategically to control portions of the fight and ensure you had the best chance possible of winning, which is maybe not the most exciting thing you can do, but it's a very good thing to do if you are trying to actually develop into a contender.
Really explosive, well-timed takedowns, too. Really, really good. He did a great job with them. It was an impressive debut against a guy in Ware who's got a lot of experience, a good fighter. That was a tough matchup on short notice.
Terry Ware is my new favorite fighter since that fight, by the way. And knowing me, I'm sure you probably already guessed that.
Terry Ware is a Conor Ruebusch special.
A tragically incomplete journeyman boxer is exactly my shit.
Yeah, I mean he is your dude. But so let's come back to Duquesnoy, because Duquesnoy is one of the most hyped prospects to debut in the UFC in a very long time. We had talked about him a bunch beforehand, and his debut, he got the finish. It was an impressive finish. He really, really put it on Patrick Williams as that fight went on, who is not a bad fighter at all. Patrick Williams, flawed, but a really, really good wrestler, a really good athlete, pretty unpredictable on the feet. Duquesnoy weathered the storm, ate the shots, took a knockdown, but got the finish.
He broke the Storm's rib. He didn't just weather it. He broke the Storm's goddamn rib.
Yeah, I mean, he was pretty vicious. He showed off his killer instinct. He showed off the depth of the kind of depth of his skill, and really, a lot of rawer guys would have folded under the kind of pressure that Williams was putting on him. Duquesnoy didn't. Duquesnoy weathered it, took it, and then very calmly went about dismantling Williams as the fight went on. So what do we take from that? There are ways that you can look at guys like Duquesnoy who have been in a lot of tough fights, and you can either say they're battle tested or they're battle scarred. Do we look at the tough fights that Duquesnoy's had against really good regional competition against a guy like Patrick Williams and say this is good for him in the long run as an incredibly talented guy? You need to have fights like that. Or do we say he should not have been getting in wars with dudes like Patrick Williams or Shea Walsh in Bama?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Personally, I think Tom Duquesnoy's record holds up. I think he's faced pretty solid competition, even on the regional circuit, better than a lot, like Brendan Loughnane and Shea Walsh and I mean, who else do we have here? Makwan Amirkhani beat him back in the day, but also Damian Rooney, decent guys. And Patrick Williams, I think, is more or less right on that level. Patrick Williams could definitely be a regional champion under the right circumstances. So I don't have any complaints about those fights as fights. And I don't think that Tom Duquesnoy is battle scarred. I would be surprised if he's really taken enough damage in his fights, although I don't know how his training is. But he's still young, so there's got to be some left in the tank. That's my feeling. But you do have to acknowledge the amount of damage he's taken in his fights. And I think for each of us who knew who Tom Duquesnoy was coming into the UFC was extremely excited for his debut because he's fucking Tom Duquesnoy and he's amazingly fun to watch. But I think the more sober side of our minds also knew, it's not going to look perfect, because it never really does with Duquesnoy. Against reasonably good competition, he is not a perfect fighter. He gets hit, and he gets hurt when he gets hit. He, like Tomas Almeida, also in this division, seems to suffer for his own aggression at times, but it is also his greatest weapon. So that's kind of what makes his fight so compelling. As a developing fighter, there is a contrast between that approach and the one we described Cody Stamen having before.
Yeah, part of the thing with Duquesnoy is he seems to have decided that he wants to fight this way. Whereas I don't think the contrast between him and Almeida is that Almeida is who he is. Almeida is a guy who wants to go out and get in bloody, violent wars, and who it's not like Almeida doesn't know how to shoot a takedown, but Almeida is almost never going to shoot a takedown. You know what I mean? Duquesnoy is an incredible grappler. He's one of the best scramblers I've ever seen. And actually, before he started deading dudes with elbows and knees and things like that, Duquesnoy was basically a wrestle grappler, a good one, a really, really good one. With a great arsenal of trips and throws in the clinch. That's why nice shot takedowns, nice scrambles.
Before his debut, people were like, well, how good's his wrestling? Because we were all talking about his striking. I was like, that's not the question to have about Tom Duquesnoy at this moment. Like, even though Patrick Williams is a good wrestler, a very good wrestler, accomplished one, Duquesnoy's wrestling is pretty damn legit. His takedown defense, his scrambling, he is, similar to Almeida in this sense, also like a younger Jose Aldo. He can be taken down. He's aggressive enough. He throws himself into his shots. You can catch him off balance, but he never rests in a position on the ground when he doesn't have to. And often that does turn into an advantageous position for submission offense too.
Yeah, he can be taken down. It's very difficult to hold him down for any extended period of time. So that's the thing there. And so the question for me is, as Duquesnoy's career goes on, does he decide he wants to just be the blood and guts guy and go out there and put on crazy ass wars because he likes doing that and because he thinks, maybe on some broader meta sense that that's what's going to gain him a fan base? Or maybe he just fucking likes it. Like, there are dudes who just like to be in gritty ass wars.
Yeah. Is he a Carlos Condit? Is he a Condit, like a mild mannered suburban dad type who loves to have his face smeared with blood? Like, maybe.
Yeah. There's a chance that that's the case. I think but I don't think that's what's going to get him all the way to the top of this division. Though he could. Like, you can't fight that way forever against the quality of competition you're going to see here and win that fight. And I think this may be the fight where that catches up to him if he decides he wants to do that, because Stamen is solid. Stamen, I don't think, is going to wear down the way that other guys that Duquesnoy has fought have. I think that Duquesnoy needs, if he wants to give himself the best chance of winning this, could win a blood and guts war, but would be better served to steer this into the clinch, to pressure, get after it, land your shots, but try to get into the clinch as soon as possible. Because what I saw from Stamen against Ware in the clinch was he's very heavily dependent on his physicality. That he's used to being shorter, stockier, stronger, with stronger hips, kind of a stronger build in general, and just kind of shucking guys off whenever he wants.
Yeah.
Whereas Duquesnoy is reliably technically sound there. Like, if you get into the clinch with Duquesnoy, Stamen will be able to shuck him off a few times. Eventually, Duquesnoy is going to stick him there and work him. So that, and I don't think it's out of the question Duquesnoy could hit takedowns if he wants them here, but really, as a matter of the fight going on, like, Duquesnoy needs to pin him against the fence and just grind his ass for a while, and do so violently, but nevertheless kind of grind him. I think that's his best path to victory. So what we're going to see here is, does Duquesnoy have it in him to kind of try to fight in a more intelligent, more reliable, less damaging way?
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's one thing I want to say about that. I don't think the problem is, well, I'm not sure if the problem is just stylistic, because obviously there are pressure fighters with very good defense. And we do know that defense comes in time. So in a sense, maybe being a young pressure fighter, there's always a risk there. You just don't have the reactions you're going to need to be very difficult to hit while being that aggressive, while putting yourself in the range of punches so frequently. But there are definitely things I think that Duquesnoy could add now, just a few conceptual kind of things to his game that would make him more effective as a pressure fighter. I'm starting to think more about. I tell you, Pat, Mayweather McGregor has a much bigger impact on how I view fighting than I expected. But I have been thinking about the differences between the metagames of boxing and MMA, because so many of my ideas and your ideas, and the sort of ideas we share about fighting styles and everything, they do have their roots in boxing. And the structure of an MMA fight is very different from a boxing match. And so, like a lot of pressure, not a lot of pressure fighters in boxing are insanely aggressive from the first round. Some are, the Aaron Pryor types, some are push a crazy pace from the get-go, but it's very different when you have 3 5-minute rounds to work in a cage rather than, 4 to potentially 12, and back in the day 15 rounds in a smaller square ring. It does really change the way that pressure fighting works. So my question is, if Tom Duquesnoy, can he be a safer pressure fighter, and how quickly can that happen? Can he make this style work, or is it, as you said, he's going to have to become a contender, he might have to abandon the style or come up with one that is more consistent?
So I think he can be a safer pressure fighter, but I think eventually he's going to transform into something like an all-around fighter. I think that pressure is going to be a thing that he does and a thing that he does very well. But I think the best case scenario for him is going to be learning to stick and move sometimes and learning to shoot reactive takedowns, let your opponent come after you. I think forward movement is always going to be part of his game, but that can't be all of it. Just because even though defense would, like improving his defense would go a long way for this, I think a lot of it is going to have to be not putting himself in position to get hit as much as he does.
Yeah, I think too is a lot of time, like Duquesnoy tends to get hit when he's throwing. That's when he's vulnerable. I think a big thing, like the one thing I would suggest if I were Tom Duquesnoy's trainer, which I'm neither qualified to be nor actually am, but I would talk about like feints and hiding movements, because the one thing that I think Duquesnoy suffers for and suffered for against Williams when he got knocked down, people can see what he's doing. And a lot of times, like, he's putting so much pressure on, they have no choice but to react. Like, he really makes people throw more than they would otherwise because he puts so much pressure on them. And because he's not feinting very effectively all that much, nor does he give his opponent things to look at, like an extending pawing jab or like a Canelo-style flash to make you think a punch is coming from this angle so you divert your attention. He doesn't have those things to disguise his angles and his attacks. It's much easier for people who have the means to counter him as he's throwing. And I would love to see Tomas Almeida do this stuff too. But similar to what I said last time we talked about Almeida, there just needs to be more of the fight in a big picture in each of the exchanges. More of an idea that like each punch is not necessarily I'm trying to get the knockout, but also, how do I build these reactions into the opponent? How do I establish the right pace? How do I land the shots now that will turn into these different shots later? And that is, to me, a big difference between these two guys. And what makes this such a compelling prospect fight is that what I saw in the Ware-Stamen fight from Cody Stamen was a pretty sober idea from him of how a fight plays out on the whole. And I'm not sure Tom Duquesnoy has that. He gets away with not having it because he's got... he can push an insane pace, and he's in extremely good shape, and he hits super hard, and even though his chin is not titanium, he recovers exceedingly well. But that's where I think he gets into problems, is that when he runs into the first guy that he can't break down merely by pushing through what they try to do to him, that he can't just succeed. You know what I mean? Because if that's why I brought up the broken rib. If he hadn't broken Williams' rib, would that fight have looked differently? Who knows? And you can say that a lot in Tom Duquesnoy's fights. If he didn't land this shot at this moment, if he didn't find this turning point, how differently might that fight have played out based on what was happening before that turning point? And that is not the case with Stamen's fight with Ware. That fight throughout looked like it was relatively... He had a clear picture of what he wanted from the bout in his head and was doing things to ensure that it happened.
So are you picking Stamen here?
I really am tempted to. I think the difference is Stamen does not have Duquesnoy's comfort in the pocket at all. And I think that is the main difference, is that Stamen he can't improvise or react on the fly with his strikes and combinations the way that Duquesnoy can. And also, I think because he is a smarter fighter in that way, not that Duquesnoy is a very thoughtful guy, in fact, but his approach is, quote unquote, more ring IQ. I think he's probably he'll be a little more averse to the exchanges that Duquesnoy is going to give him no choice but to constantly react to. And so I do think Stamen, it might put him in, at least at this stage in his development, he might find himself in a position where he has to make something happen to win. And I'm not sure that he's capable of winning that kind of fight, whereas Duquesnoy always is. So I'm still going to go with the Fire Kid. But, obviously there are some questions about his style going forward, and I'm most interested in this fight because I want to see how he addresses those against who I consider to be a pretty solid opponent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm also taking Duquesnoy. The big reason is because I didn't like how Stamen reacted to pressure in the last fight. I don't think he had a good sense of where he was in the cage.
Right.
And Ware was not trying that hard to pressure him, and Stamen still backed himself up. And when Stamen backed himself up, he was really hittable. That's when Ware had his greatest success in moving between the head and the body, putting combinations together, and in getting hit in the clinch also.
Yeah.
That he basically gave Ware the initiative to pick and choose clinch exchanges if he wanted them. And he would kind of just like try to shuck Ware off at that point, and it worked because he was so obviously stronger physically than Ware was. I think that's going to be his downfall here. And the real question to me in this fight is going to be, how much damage does Duquesnoy take? That's the thing that I really want to watch. I see Stamen's path to victory. I see how he wins this fight. The one book that has a line listed here has this as an even money fight, and I understand why that is. I think that Stamen's path to victory is pretty clear. Keep this out in the middle of the cage, work your combination boxing, hit the hittable guy, counter, and then duck under and try to hit takedowns whenever possible. That's a totally viable path to victory.
For sure.
And it would not at all surprise me if Stamen did. But I don't think Duquesnoy is going to give him that fight. And I think even though we can criticize Duquesnoy in kind of the broad context of his career for choosing to have blood and guts fights when he doesn't necessarily have to have them, I think the willingness to do that here is going to win him the fight. And the question to me is, does he use that pressure to back Stamen up to throw hands, or does he back him up and then clinch him?
Yeah.
And if he chooses to clinch him in those things, chooses to minimize the amount of damage he takes, then I think I will be much more confident about Duquesnoy's. I have pegged him as like a future top 5 guy forever. I will be crystal clear and comfortable making that, continuing to make that prediction if he does it.
Yeah, because especially at this stage, at this level of development, the question is not so much, are there opportunities to catch Duquesnoy while he's doing what he does? It's, can you find the nerve to catch him while he's doing what he does? And that's the difficulty. Duquesnoy is going to fight his fight. And if he doesn't, maybe it'll make it even more interesting for Stamen. Maybe Stamen will have an easier time adapting to a new Duquesnoy if we see a new Tom Duquesnoy. Who knows? It's a great fight, and I'm very excited for it. And on that note, we've got one more to talk about. We're going to do this very quickly, just give a few thoughts. We wanted to talk about Beneil Dariush versus Evan Dunham. Dunham, of course, was my pick on a recent episode for I considered him one of the best unranked fighters in the UFC. I don't think he's in the top 10 of his division, but he's been very solid for a very long time and has still been turning in very solid performances. And Beneil Dariush, I think, is this is like a perfect matchup for where both of these guys are as fighters, where both of them sit, I think, in their division. To me, you could put either one of these guys at ranking 7 or 8, and it would feel totally right to me. And that's why I like this fight. It is a very good sorting fight for two guys who seem to have that next level potential, but are continually held back by little things.
Yeah, I think that's a good read on this fight. It's an interesting matchup to me. And I'm kind of surprised that Dariush is as big a favorite as he is. He's minus 230.
That surprises me too.
Yeah, I don't think that Dunham is getting enough credit here for his pace, his kind of rugged takedown defense, his physicality, or the quality of his grappling skill. I'm a little confused by that line because I think Dariush can fight at pace, but Dunham's pace is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I think Dariush is the more damaging puncher and certainly kicker, but Dunham can just put volume on you. He can just take it with volume. We've seen that from him against other quick-paced fighters before. He's not going to be easy to take down, and if this fight gets to the mat, it's not a given that Dariush really makes something happen there. So those are kind of the variables that I'm looking at here. I still think Dariush is the more dangerous guy, mm-hmm. and that's the reason why I would lean toward him here. But Dunham can just stick and move and just land volume, stuff takedowns, and he's got a pretty good chance at winning. He
could also potentially pressure Dariush, which he, the thing that's interesting here is that both guys are pretty flexible stylistically. Dariush, as we saw in the Michael Johnson fight, it was a very controversial win, and most still think he didn't deserve it, which I think is all right because it was, if you had to pick somebody, most people picked Michael Johnson. Did you come around on that, actually? I think you brought that up recently, right? That you had originally thought that Dariush won, and then you changed your minds. Maybe not. I might be slandering you.
No, I thought that Johnson won it at the time, but it was not a fight where I was that fired up about it. Like, I didn't think it was that much of a robbery. I thought Johnson won, but like, I get scoring it for Dariush. I'm not that busted up.
And the reason you can get scoring it for Dariush is because like he did a pretty good job responding to an aggressive opponent and working his jab and fighting from distance and using his feet to stay more or less in the center of the cage a lot of the time. And
he did a great job against Edson Barboza too. He fought Barboza perfectly before the flying knee. He just got his fucking head taken.
And that was with the pressure, which is what we've also seen from Dariush, like a lot of other Cordero fighters. Dunham can do that too. Dunham can walk people down and use that. He can force that pace on people, but he's also technically a very fundamentally sound boxer, and can fight off the back foot and keep people on the end of a jab. He did a good bit of that in his fight with, I'm forgetting his name. Who's our long-armed boy? Rick Glenn, who just had his, sadly tainted win over Gavin Tucker. But Dunham showed flexibility in his fights as well. I think one more thing, very specific tactical thing, but southpaw versus southpaw does mean no easy body kick for Beneil Dariush, which may actually be significant in this fight because that is one of his main weapons. It's not going to be there the same way as it is against most opponents.
I think he'll just end up going to the leg with it instead.
Probably.
Like, I don't think he's going to abandon it.
But but I think that Evan Dunham, like, nobody can take perfect liver kicks for long, but Evan Dunham is probably tough enough to weather some leg kicks as he works his game plan. Like, I think that's a less potent weapon than the liver kick.
Yeah, I'm going to be really interested. I think the turning point here is going to be the clinch and who wins the clinch, because Dariush is more damaging, but is probably going to throw less than Dunham on the feet. As in the wrestling exchanges, they're both pretty dang good wrestlers, pretty underrated wrestlers. But I think that's not, if not exactly a wash, still fairly close. Going to depend a lot on who dictates when and where the takedown exchanges happen. On top, Dariush is a monster, and I think Dariush can, but probably would not finish Dunham from top position. It's really going to be the clinch. Like, if they're clinching along the fence for extended periods of time, I think they're both pretty rugged in there, but I think Dariush is a little meaner, and that's enough to make me lean toward him. But I think it's probably going to be a decision and not a finish, and a close one, 29-28.
Yeah, I think meanness might actually be the key difference here. Like, fighting Evan Dunham is like standing in a closed room and there's just a bunch of molasses pouring in. And yeah, molasses is slow and not threatening in its speed at all. But when there's enough molasses, he's just going to drown. Like, he's not a fast man, but at all, he might be the slowest lightweight in the division actually. But his pace is just also like Rick Glenn, like just very methodical, non-stop. It just keeps chugging along. But I don't think he has that same killer instinct to really just go for it and pour on the offense, which really counts against a guy like Evan Dunham. It counts against somebody who is maybe not quick enough to catch up when you spring on him with 3 or 4 shots in a row. And I do think those kinds of things can be the difference for Dariush. I think he's probably got a little more power. I think he's got a little more of a mean streak in him. And I think he can push forward enough that he can make Evan Dunham's pace not as much of a problem as it would be otherwise. Dariush is a pretty solid pressure fighter at this point. So I'm going to go with Dariush as well. But I really like the fight, man. I'm really a fan of it.
Yeah, I'm here for this. This is just going to be a fun card. I'm looking forward to watching these fights. I'm looking forward to breaking it down next week too.
Same. And because I know there are probably 3 people on the planet who like heavy hands and also are big fans of the Late Late Show with Craig Ferguson, which is what our intro was. But because Craig would always wrap up his show with a special outro, I'm going to do my own little parody of that. Are you ready for this, Pat? I'm going to sing on the show.
Born ready.
Here we go. What do you have coming out this week, Pat? Our classic ending segment. What do you got this week?
I have a couple of things. I have an article on Deadspin about Demetrius Johnson and his greatness. Then I may have one on the Washington Post, but I'm not sure. And then I have a new episode of Tides of History. It's an interview with the historian Dan Jones, who just wrote a fantastic book about the Knights Templar, which is fucking fascinating. It's a great book. It was a great interview. It was a real pleasure to talk to him. And I think people will enjoy this. If you're interested in a chill, smart dude talking about the Knights Templar, Dan Jones is your guy. So check that out. That'll be out on Thursday.
In many ways, originators of the modern banking system, the Templars. Is that correct, Pat?
Yeah, in some ways. They were on the cutting edge of European finance in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries.
We have so much to thank them for.
Yeah,
Thank God for modern banking.
Well, this is things like the idea of credit and deposits, and like the
Bank
idea
notes.
that you don't have to physically move huge amounts of cash from place to place. Like, those are enormous advances.
This is back in an era where people didn't realize that like it was novel when you're like, you know what? You don't have to buy things with treasure. You can leave the treasure somewhere and just tell someone it's theirs.
Well, think about like all of the things that have to be in place for you to agree to that. Like, you have to trust people.
Yeah.
You have to have trust. You have to have the idea that if you leave something there, it will physically be there when you try to get it out. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that we kind of take for granted, like, and institutions that we take for granted that didn't exist.
I don't, but that's why I keep my bullion in a mattress.
That's fair. That's fair. How is that on your back? That's got to be pretty tough sleeping wise.
It's not quite a Princess and the Pea situation. I mean, I'm not, no one's impressed that I can feel the mound of gold under my mattress, but at least I know where it is, you know, and
That's
I also
fair.
know where my hernia is.
What are you doing this week?
Something on Tony Ferguson. Obviously the first segment of the show was awesome. I had a lot of fun talking about Tony. I'm going to write a piece looking at his game and the idiosyncratic way he navigates the flowchart of fighting. I really think sets him apart from all other fighters. So I'm not 100% sure how that's going to be, but I am determined to put out a piece trying to capture the mystery of Tony Ferguson's clearly deliberate but otherwise completely insane fighting style.
I look forward to reading that.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening, for tuning in. This has been Heavy Hands. Find us on social media. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. I am at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. Both of those on Twitter. Find us on Facebook, Facebook.com/Patrick Wyman MMA or /Connor Ruebusch MMA. And also check out a bonus episode that we're going to have coming out this week. You can also find all the other episodes of shows like The Historical Perspective and The Underdogs and all the other bonus things we've done, including special interviews, features, all kinds of magical stuff like that on our Patreon. So check out Heavy Hands on Patreon if you are not already subscribed. It's very affordable and we appreciate the help and we try our best to make it worth your while. On that note, we have a bonus episode to record now, so thank you everybody for tuning in. This has been Heavy Hands. If you came here for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. I said it once already, didn't I? All right, bye.